London was fast asleep when it happened. A cough echoed through an empty alley, deep, human, unmistakable. But when the constable turned toward the sound, there was no one there, only a shadow, trembling against the wall, as if it had made the noise itself by morning. A man was found dead, no struggle, no weapon, just a strange smear of soot on the floor, and the echo of that impossible cough. When Sherlock Holmes arrived, he didn't chase ghosts. He followed logic, and yet what he uncovered blurred the line between light, sound, and fear itself. Because sometimes, even a shadow can tell a story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this send chills down your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next impossible case from Baker Street. Now, pick up your cup of tea, take a deep breath, and step into the darkness with me. This is Sherlock Holmes and the Shadow That Coughed. Chapter 1. The Shadow That Coughed. It began, as so many curious cases did, on a fog-thickened morning in late October. London lay submerged beneath a blanket of grimy mist, chimney smoke settling like soot on the cobbled streets, and the gas lamps casting halos rather than clarity. I remember distinctly that the smell of damp stone and horse sweat lingered in the air as I pulled the curtain back and peered down into Baker Street, watching a figure materialize from the fog, as if summoned by thought alone. Sherlock Holmes, seated in his armchair with a Turkish slipper between his fingers, his peculiar tobacco vessel of choice, did not look up when I announced, "There is a visitor, Holmes." A strange one, judging by the way he walks, hurried yet halting, as though fearful of being watched. At this, Holmes allowed himself a thin smile and tapped the ash from his cigarette into the fireplace. "You describe Mr. Ransom precisely, Watson. Allow him in." Before I could question him, the doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession. Mrs. Hudson showed in, a lean man of about 40, with gaunt cheeks, watery eyes, and a cravat poorly knotted. His coat, though tailored, bore signs of agitation: creased sleeves, muddy hems, and one pocket turned slightly inside out as though searched in haste. He removed his hat, glanced over his shoulder, then turned back toward us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for receiving me. I believe I am being hunted." "Indeed," said Holmes mildly, "and by something rather more abstract than a man with a revolver, if I'm not mistaken." The man flinched. "I know that you have not slept in 2 nights," Holmes said coolly. "Your hands tremble, not from cold, but from fatigue. The soot on your cuff is recent. It matches the chimney residue found in certain parts of Shoreditch. A hiding place, perhaps. And yet here you are, alive and frightened, but unharmed. So not hunted, Mr. Ransom, haunted?" The man's pale face turned a shade grayer. "Yes," he whispered, "that is the word, haunted." I fetched the man a brandy, while Holmes leaned forward, hands steepled. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Ransom, and tell us everything, especially the part about the cough." Ransom looked at the hearth, as though needing its warmth to steel his nerves. "3 days ago," he began, "I returned late to my lodgings in Dorian Lane, Whitechapel. My servant had already retired. As I ascended the stairs, I heard a sound behind me, faint, almost polite. A single cough." He paused. "But no one was there. The stairs were empty. I stood, listening, Nothing. A common enough sound in a city of consumptives, I remarked gently. Except, Ransom replied, that I heard it again that night, and the next. Always behind me, never in sight. Holmes' eyes gleamed. But that is not the worst of it, Ransom continued, gripping his glass with both hands. Last night I came home early. I locked the doors myself. I bolted the windows. I went to bed with my service revolver on the nightstand. I tried to sleep. But precisely at midnight, no, because I had been watching the clock, I heard the cough again. Not outside, not in the stairwell, inside my room. He shivered. It was a dry, shallow cough. Not loud, not violent, but close. It came from the far corner, by the dresser. And when I lit my lamp, I saw nothing. Holmes did not speak. He rose and paced. And this morning, Ransom said, I found something on my pillow. Something impossible. Holmes paused. You have it with you. Ransom produced a white handkerchief folded into quarters. Holmes took it delicately, unfolded it, and revealed a single thin strand of what appeared to be ash. Yet it did not disintegrate when touched. Rather, it curled like thread, but gleamed faintly like iron filings in the light. I have no fireplace in my room, said Ransom. Holmes nodded. You are not mad, Mr. Ransom, nor the victim of your own imagination. Tell me, have you enemies? None that I know of. Lovers? Ransom hesitated. None recent family. A brother distant, lives in Kent. Holmes made no note of this. And your profession? I am assistant curator at the Royal Surgical College. At this, Holmes looked up sharply. Ah, what is it? I asked. Holmes said nothing, only folded the strange ash thread into his notebook and shut it. Mr. Ransom, I require access to your lodgings, immediately. Watson, coat and hat. We go to Dorian Lane. Ransom rose with relief, but Holmes raised a hand. Not yet. You will remain here until I return. The cough, I suspect, is not following you. It is waiting. We took a cab through the broom-cloaked streets. The cab horse's hooves splashed silently through puddles as we turned into narrower alleys where the fog thickened and sound died. Holmes, I asked, do you truly believe this is not the work of a living man? He did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed beyond the cab window. Everything living leaves a trace, he said at last. Even the dead do not vanish without a mark. But something here is not right. We arrived at Dorian Lane more of an alley than a street hand, stepped into a row of somber, leaning buildings. Ransom's lodging house was a pale brick affair with peeling green shutters and no gaslight at its front. We entered by skeleton key. Holmes moved silently, every sense tuned. He inspected the locks, the stairwell, the threadbare carpet, even the coat hooks. At the top of the stairs, he paused and sniffed. Something sweet, he murmured. Not perfume chloroform, perhaps, but faint, very faint. The bedroom was neat, but unremarkably until Holmes turned down the pillow. He bent over the bed and tapped something with his finger. A scratch, he whispered. Tiny, but recent. Scratch. I leaned closer. Indeed, upon the wooden headboard was a fine line, scarcely longer than a sewing needle. Too neat to be random. Holmes walked to the dresser and opened each drawer. Then he turned to the corner where the cough had allegedly emerged, and there, on the floorboards, was a single smudge, small, black, oval-shaped, and unmistakably burned into the wood. Holmes looked at me then, not with triumph, but concern. "Watson," he said, "I do not yet understand what we are witnessing. But I believe Mr. Ransom's life depends on what happens in the next 24 hours." And from somewhere beyond the doorframe, a faint cough echoed down the hallway, a dry, shallow cough, one that did not belong to either of us. Chapter 2: Holmes and Watson's First Discussion. We returned to Baker Street, long after midnight, the fog still clinging to the city like a second skin. Ransom had fallen asleep on the settee, his face twitching with dreams he likely did not wish to recall. Holmes moved past him without a word, his long fingers clasped behind his back as he paced before the fireplace. The silence in the room was weighty, but not empty. It was the silence of thought gathering force. I watched him for some time before finally breaking the stillness. "Well, Holmes, what do you make of it?" I asked, trying to sound curious rather than unsettled. I had not forgotten the cough. It had sounded as clear and human as any I had heard in the wards of St. Bartholomew's, but it came from nowhere. And that was the very thing that unnerved me. Holmes stopped and turned toward me, his features drawn into that peculiar expression he often wore in the early stages of a case-at, once distant and calculating, like a man reading a cipher backwards. "There is something in that room," he said softly, "that does not belong. But it is not the cough that concerns me. It is the context of the cough. It comes at the wrong times, in the wrong places. And the residue, Watson, did you note the scorch mark on the floor?" I nodded. "Too precise for a candle or coal spark," he continued, "and too contained for ordinary flame. It suggests heat without fire. That makes me think not of something supernatural, but of something intended a message, perhaps." "You mean to say," I ventured, "that someone is planting these clues deliberately? But to what end? To frighten Ransom? Drive him mad?" Holmes gave a short nod. "Possibly. Or possibly to cover something more mundane. In criminal matters, Watson, it is often not the ghost one should fear, but the man pretending to be one. Ransom's position at the Royal Surgical College intrigues me. A curator may not seem to the average observer to be a man of importance, but consider he handles donations, oversees acquisitions, catalogs, anatomy specimens. Access, my dear Watson, often proves more valuable than authority." We both turned as Ransom stirred, murmuring in his sleep. Holmes walked quietly over and placed a folded blanket atop him, his manner uncharacteristically gentle. Then he moved to his desk and lit a small lamp, pulling a sheaf of correspondence toward him. I watched as he thumbed quickly through the letters, pausing at one bearing a red wax seal. "From Inspector Lestrade," Holmes muttered. "Arrived this morning. Curious that I didn't open it earlier." He broke the seal and read silently for a minute. "Ah," he said at last. "Now the edges begin to take shape." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "A body," Holmes replied, without lifting his eyes from the page. "Found yesterday morning in Wapping. Cause of death unknown. No sign of violence, but the physician noted an odd burn along the upper spine. Just one small oval, rather like the one we saw scorched into the floor of Ransom's bedroom." A chill slid down my back. Coincidence. "Coincidence is a tool for the unimaginative," Holmes replied dryly. There is a pattern here, Watson. A pattern of marks and misdirection. I would wager the victim from Wapping, to heard the cough, though he is in no state to confirm it. We must visit the morgue at first light. I wish to examine that mark for myself. I could not sleep that night, not for the lingering sound of that ghostly cough, but for the idea that someone or something was reaching across the fog-veiled city and leaving a trail that only Holmes could follow. At some hour near dawn, I heard him rise and pace again, the occasional scratch of his violin bow sounding like a whisper in the dark. It was his way of thinking, of pulling chaos into order through strings and resonance. By the time the lamps outside flickered and the morning milkman rumbled past, Holmes was dressed, hat in hand, and already moving toward the door. "We go to Wapping, Watson," he said. "There is a silence in that corpse that may speak louder than anything Ransom has yet told us." We rode in silence, the streets less shrouded now, but no less grim. The city looked tired. At the Whitechapel mortuary, we were met by a red-eyed attendant who knew Holmes by reputation and gave no protest as we descended into the sterile cold of the lower rooms. The body, a man in his 30s, nameless, still lay on the slab. Holmes pulled the sheet back to expose the shoulders, then bent low with a magnifier. I watched as his face grew still. "It is identical," he said. "The same shape, the same depth. Watson, what does this remind you of?" He stepped aside and gestured for me to examine it. I leaned in. The burn was no larger than a halfpenny. The skin was blackened in a way that did not suggest open flame nor cautery. It was too clean, too exact. "It looks like something metallic was heated and pressed there," I said. "Not a brand, though. There's no pattern." Holmes nodded. "No symbol, no letter. Just the presence of pressure and heat. Enough to scar, not enough to kill. But the man is dead nonetheless." "What of the organs?" I asked the attendant. "All healthy," he replied. "No rupture, no bleeding, no known poison." It's as though he simply stopped. Holmes stood deep in thought. "It is the method that troubles me," he said softly. "If a thing can burn without fire and kill without wounding, we are dealing with a weapon or a lie." He drew the sheet back over the corpse, then turned. "Back to Baker Street, Watson. I must consult the archives. There is a case years ago, perhaps forgotten by now, but I suspect it has left behind a shadow. And that shadow, Watson, may well be the one that coughed." Chapter 3. The first clues. A scene of deception. Holmes spent the next 2 hours in the depths of our Baker Street archive, rifling through files and clippings with the single-minded intensity of a predator sifting through tracks in the dust. I sat nearby, scribbling in my notebook, though my mind remained fixed on the expressionless corpse in the Wapping mortuary. That Mark's small, silent final had lodged itself into my thoughts. Holmes worked in silence, except for the occasional muttered date or phrase. Blackburn Asylum fire, 1887. Unexplained dormitory injuries. Burnt cloth with no flame. He was chasing something through history, and I was not yet permitted to see what prey he stalked, when at last he surfaced. His long fingers trailing over the corner of a worn newsprint, he gave a soft awe of satisfaction and held up a page for me to see. It was yellowed and brittle, bearing a short column from a decade past. 3 found dead in locked room, unmarked but scarred. Holmes tapped the final line, where a coroner had noted a curious ovoid impression, darkened as if by heat. though no sign of fire found in the room. I read the piece twice and looked up. "The same mark?" I asked. "Almost certainly," Holmes replied. "The location differs back of the neck rather than shoulder, but the effect, the absence of violence, and the silence surrounding their deaths are too alike to dismiss. It is not a new method, Watson. It is a re-emergence." We were interrupted by a knock, sharp, urgent. Mrs. Hudson opened the door, her face pale, and behind her stood a uniformed constable, cap in hand. "Message from Inspector Lestrade, sir," the young man said. "Urgent. Another case, sir. Another body." Holmes took the slip of paper with a glance. His jaw tensed slightly. "Where?" I asked Fitzrovia. "Just off Charlotte Street," Holmes said. "An abandoned warehouse. The owner found the place broken into this morning. One of his night watchmen is missing, presumed." "The victim, presumed," I echoed. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "No body found, Watson. Only a cough. One that did not come from any man on sight." By the time we reached Fitzrovia, the clouds had begun to part, casting long, gray shadows across the brick walls and soot-darkened windows of the derelict warehouse. Lestrade was waiting just inside, chewing the end of a pencil and glaring at a set of muddy footprints that stopped mid-stride beneath a shattered window. "You're late," he muttered, though without conviction. "And this one's worse than the last." Holmes made no reply. He moved directly to the footprints and examined the floor with care. Then he raised his eyes to the rafters above. "The prints stop here," he said. "But not because he turned. Because he vanished." "Vanished?" Lestrade scoffed. "More likely he was dragged." "Dragged prints showed different depth," Holmes murmured, kneeling. "These are even. There is no scuff at the toe or heel. No blood, no signs of struggle, and yet no exit." I stepped forward and studied the dust around the prints. It was true, they halted abruptly, like a man had walked into the air itself. Holmes stood and walked the perimeter of the warehouse, tapping the walls with the end of his cane, until he came to a large iron door, half buried behind a stack of rotted crates. With effort, he forced it open. Inside was a narrow room, empty but for a single object lying in the center of the floor. A coat, black wool, torn at the shoulder and badly scorched along the collar. Holmes crouched beside it. "The same shape again," he said. "This confirms the progression. Whoever or whatever is doing this is accelerating." Lestrade frowned. "And the cough. You believe it's connected?" Holmes stood slowly. 3 witnesses claim to have heard it this morning, each in a different part of the building. None saw a source, and none of them were harmed. That suggests the cough is not the danger. It is the herald, a sign that something is near. I felt a shudder pass through me at his tone. Holmes, who had faced down murderers, anarchists, and traitors with no more than a raised brow, was visibly tense. He turned to me. "Watson, examine this coat carefully. Note the lining, the stitching. This was not made for a common watchman. This is tailored, high quality, likely not even his." "We are being led astray. By whom?" I asked. Holmes looked at Lestrade. "You found no blood, no broken lock, no weapon. Yet you assume a victim. You assume a crime. But I believe this warehouse was prepared, not for theft, but for theater." Holmes bent down once more and picked something from the floor beside the coat. A single scrap of black fabric, charred and brittle. He turned it in his fingers and then showed it to us. Embedded in the weave was a tiny metal clasp shaped like a surgical pin from a medical apron, I said. Or a museum display, Holmes replied. His eyes narrowed. We return to Ransom's lodgings tonight, he said, voice low. Whatever is haunting him began before the cough. We missed something the first time, Watson, and I do not believe we shall be given a third chance. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects that evening. The fog returned with the solemnity of a curtain falling on a stage, thick and slow and low to the ground, muffling the clatter of wheels and hooves as Holmes and I made our way once again to Dorian Lane. Ransom greeted us with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot and his voice husky from disuse. He had not ventured outside all day, he said, and had twice thought he heard the cough again, once near the stairwell, and once, far more disturbingly, just outside the glass of his bedroom window. Holmes listened to him without speaking, glancing now and then toward the upper floors. When Ransom finished, Holmes gave him a single instruction: to summon 3 individuals to the flat by 8 o'clock that evening, all of whom he had referenced in his papers or letters over the last fortnight. Ransom blinked at the oddity of the request, but complied without question. By 8:15, the drawing-room of the narrow lodging-house was uncomfortably full. Holmes stood near the mantel, his arms folded, watching the door as the final guest, a thin, anxious-looking man with spectacles and a small leather case, stepped inside. Ransom introduced him as Mr. Alec Morgan, a clerk at the Royal Surgical College. The other 2, already seated, were Miss Lillian Gray, a pale woman of remarkable posture who claimed to be Ransom's neighbor, and Dr. Hubert Thwaite, silver-bearded anatomist with a reputation for both brilliance and cruelty in the dissection hall. Holmes waited until the silence had become strained, then cleared his throat. "I thank you all for attending on such short notice," he began. "This is not, as you might expect, a gathering of concern for Mr. Ransom's mental state, nor a rehearsal for some medical conference. It is a matter of life and death, possibly your own." There was a flicker of reaction. Morgan looked to the door. Miss Gray pressed her fingers together in her lap, and Dr. Thwaite merely raised an eyebrow. "Each of you," Holmes continued, "has had recent contact with Mr. Ransom in professional or personal form. Each of you has either entered or visited this house, and each of you, knowingly or not, may hold a piece of a very unusual puzzle." "You're suggesting we're suspects," Thwaite rumbled. "I suggest nothing, I observe." He gestured for me to retrieve the scorched coat from the warehouse. I unfolded it and laid it on the table. The room grew quiet. "This was found at a supposed crime scene," Holmes said, "yet bears the tailoring of a man who would not be employed as a night watchman. Inside the lining is a clasp from a surgical apron, likely the kind used in museum preparation or anatomical display." Miss Gray spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft and exact. "I've seen coats like that at the college. They wear them in the specimen wing. It isn't unusual." "But it is unusual," Holmes replied, "when it turns up in an abandoned warehouse, scorched and left deliberately beneath a broken window. The scene was staged. For effect." Morgan wiped his glasses. "Then someone is trying to frighten him, or us." "Frighten," Holmes repeated, "or warn." Dr. Thwaite snorted. "This is absurd. Ghosts, coughs, coats? This sounds more like a penny dreadful than a proper investigation." Holmes turned his eyes on Thwaite, expression unreadable. "And yet you came when summoned." "Why?" There was a pause. "Curiosity," Thwaite said, though his tone lacked certainty at that moment. A sound broke the tension, the long, quiet creak of a floorboard above. All eyes turned to the ceiling. Ransom paled visibly. "I bolted the bedroom," he said. "There's no one up there." Holmes moved first, ascending the steps silently. Watson and I followed. The door to the bedroom stood slightly ajar, though Ransom swore he had shut it. Holmes entered first, scanned the room, then pointed toward the dresser. There, beside the mirror, was a single, fresh scorch mark. "Exactly where the cough was heard the first time," I said. Holmes stepped forward and crouched. "It's warm," he said. "Just minutes old." When we returned downstairs, the guests were uneasy. Miss Gray clutched her shawl. Morgan stood, ready to leave. Dr. Thwaite, however, remained seated. Holmes addressed the room again. "I believe the cough is a decoy," he said. "A repeated signal used by someone with access to Ransom's habits and home. The marks are left not randomly, but purposefully, to imply a haunting, and yet they require heat, fire, tools. This is not the work of phantoms. It is the work of hands." He turned then and looked directly at Miss Gray. "You mentioned the college. Tell me who else, in recent weeks, has had cause to handle specimens from the vault." She hesitated. "All of us, really. There was a recent inventory. Some old donations being re-examined. Mr. Morgan handled the records. Dr. Thwaite did most of the analysis." "Did anything go missing?" Holmes asked. Morgan answered, voice trembling. "Yes, one item. An unlisted item, really. A sealed box, unlabeled, buried in the lowest shelves. It disappeared before anyone could catalog it. Ransom said he'd never seen it before." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "And what was in it?" "No one knows," Morgan said. "Only the seal, a copper clasp in the shape of an eye." Holmes turned slowly to me. "Watson, make a note. This isn't just a murder or a haunting. It is something that was unearthed, something that should have stayed buried." Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring the following morning found Holmes in one of his moods, sharp-eyed and silent, yet restless in movement. He paced our Baker Street sitting room with the energy of a man chasing thoughts too swift for paper, his long fingers twitching toward the fireplace, then back to his coat, only to resume their motion behind his back. I watched him from the armchair, still mulling over the previous evening's gathering. Something about Morgan's hesitancy, or perhaps Miss Gray's unnaturally calm demeanor, lingered in my mind like a faint taste of something bitter. Yet Holmes had said nothing of suspects when we left Dorian Lane. Only that we must not be too quick to believe what frightened men wish us to believe. After nearly an hour of silence, Holmes stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Lestrade is already building a case against Dr. Thwaite," he said. "It would be prudent to examine the reasons why he is wrong." I raised my brow. Thwaite. But he did seem the most resistant to questioning. And his proximity to the college, his authority, he would have easy access to the sealed box. Holmes gave a faint nod. "Exactly why he's the obvious choice. And obvious, Watson, is nearly always wrong. Lestrade sent word this morning, apparently." The burned coat found in the warehouse was traced to an old set of garments from the college's display wing, donated years ago under Thwaite's supervision. He has no alibi for the night the watchman vanished. And worse still, he's made several large purchases of medical instruments in recent weeks, coagulant sol of which could be used to simulate the peculiar scorch marks we've observed. I set my teacup down. Then surely he's guilty. No, Holmes said quietly. He is prepared to be found guilty. Before I could reply, a knock came at the door. Lestrade himself entered, looking self-satisfied in a way that warned of overconfidence. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, brushing rain from his shoulders. "Thought I'd deliver the good news myself. We've taken Dr. Hubert Thwaite into custody, interfered with museum records, ordered volatile chemicals under false names, and, most curiously, kept a pair of gloves with the same sort of burn pattern you noted at the ransom home. I dare say the man's a lunatic in a scholar's coat." Holmes didn't move from the hearth. "Did you find the missing box?" Lestrade hesitated. "No, still no trace. But we think Thwaite destroyed it. There's residue in his fireplace. Looks like wood and metal melted together." "Too convenient," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, did he resist arrest?" "Not at all. In fact, he seemed almost amused." At this, Holmes turned and fixed Lestrade with a sharp look. "Because it amuses him to be suspected, Inspector. Or rather, it suits his purpose. He may be a difficult man, but he is no fool. If someone has gone to great lengths to engineer the illusion of guilt around him, then that same someone understands Thwaite's reputation well enough to use it against him." Lestrade frowned. "You mean he's being framed?" "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps he's part of something larger, willingly or not. Either way, we are being handed an answer far too soon, and it would be a mistake to accept it." The inspector left soon after, unconvinced but content with his progress. Holmes watched him go with a faint sigh, then turned to me. "We must speak to Miss Grey again, but not in her parlor. We must see her in motion, Watson unaware. It is in the unscripted moments that truth leaks out." We took a cab to the street where Miss Grey lived, but Holmes instructed the driver to pass by slowly. Through the carriage window, we watched as Miss Grey stepped out of her front door, well-dressed, composed, and holding a single white envelope. She moved with purpose, not the idle grace of a woman on an afternoon errand, but with the cautious urgency of someone about to do something secret. "She's delivering a letter," Holmes said, tapping the side of the window. "Not posting it. See how she holds it unsealed. She's going to hand it off." We exited the cab at the next corner and followed her at a distance. She walked for nearly 10 minutes, always glancing twice before crossing a street, once checking her reflection in a shop window. Then, outside a quiet chemist's, she paused. A man emerged, a tall figure with a limp and a dark coat too long for the season. Without a word, she passed the envelope to him. He nodded once and disappeared down the alley. Holmes moved quickly, leading us around the rear of the building. We turned the corner, but the man was gonna vanish like smoke. Only the envelope lay on the ground, flattened slightly, as if dropped in haste. Holmes picked it up and unfolded the page inside. There were only 4 words, scrawled hastily. "They know. Bury it." We stood in silence for a long moment. "She is no mere bystander," Holmes said at last. She is part of the engine behind this illusion. Whether willingly or under pressure, I cannot yet say. I looked down the empty alley, and the man, Holmes's voice was grim. He did not cough, Watson, but I suspect we will hear from him soon enough. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency was nearing midnight when we returned to Baker Street, the envelope from Miss Gray still in Holmes's coat pocket, though its 4 cryptic words had not ceased to echo between us. They know. Bury it. The phrasing, Holmes had remarked on the cab ride back, suggested urgency, but also coordination. Not a lone criminal's panic, but the reaction of someone bound by a larger scheme, one with rules and triggers. As soon as we entered the sitting room, Holmes pulled out his index of college correspondences, spreading several letters across the floor like a chessboard. I busied myself refilling the fire and setting out tea, though Holmes did not touch his. He was already reading one letter aloud, half to himself. This, he said, holding up a creased sheet, was written by Ransom to the head curator 3 weeks ago, requesting a ledger from the 1860s an inventory of private acquisitions. During our questioning, he claimed no knowledge of the sealed box in the lower vault. Holmes's brow furrowed. Why would he request access to forgotten records if he wasn't aware of what might be hidden in them? I blinked. You believe Ransom lied to us? I believe, Holmes replied, that he omitted something critical, not to mislead, perhaps, but to protect someone or himself. He began searching through the older notes again, lifting one sheet with sudden energy. Ah, and here's the reply. See the signature, Alec Morgan, our nervous clerk, the very man who claimed he hadn't handled the box directly, and yet here he is, responding to a request concerning it. He passed me both letters. And indeed, Morgan's reply bore the same careful, slanted hand we had seen on the envelope Miss Gray had handed off earlier that day. A neat inconsistency had emerged. Morgan knew of the box before it vanished, yet acted as though it had never been invented. Ransom, too, had feigned ignorance of what he had requested, and Miss Gray was passing notes to someone Holmes had not yet named. All 3, it seemed, were orbiting the same object, an object that no one wished to claim. The hour passed in a silence broken only by Holmes's scribbles and the creak of old wood beneath our feet. Finally, he set down his pen. Watson, he said, we are no longer chasing a crime, but a history. Something was buried beneath that college, not in the physical sense, perhaps, but in its record, sealed, denied, and now dislodged. And the more I trace these names, the more I suspect it is not the object itself that kills, but the idea of it. You mean the coughing? I said. Yes, Holmes said, rising, and the scorch marks. Both serve as signals, not for the dead, but for the living. He moved to the window and looked out into the street. The man in the alley, Miss Gray's contact. He didn't cough, which tells me he isn't part of the pattern. He's an agent of prevention, someone tasked with containing knowledge. But who would I? Was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. 3 raps, slow and measured. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He moved to the door and opened it himself. On the step stood Alec Morgan, his hat in hand, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. I need to speak, he said, voice trembling, before it's too late. We brought him in, and he stood just inside the warmth of the room, like a man not sure if he was welcome. Holmes gestured toward the hearth. But Morgan didn't sit. I lied, he began, about the box. I handled it. I opened it. And what did you find? Holmes asked, gently. Morgan swallowed. Not much. A mask, old, carved from dark wood, with grooves like veins and a strange, chemical smell. And a paper sealed with copper. I didn't open the paper. I was afraid to. I only glanced at the mask and shut it again. Holmes stepped closer. Where is it now? I don't know, Morgan said. That same night, I went back to check. Someone had already taken it. No signs of forced entry, just ... gone. And the next morning, I heard the cough, right behind me in the corridor. I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But then Miss Gray asked if I'd told anyone. I hadn't. I swore it. And you believed that would protect you? Holmes asked. Morgan's mouth opened, but no words came. Holmes stepped back. The letter, he said. You were the one she handed the note to. You are part of the same circle. Morgan nodded. She said if I didn't deliver it, the coughing wouldn't stop. Who is she working with? I asked. I don't know his name, Morgan said, but she calls him the listener. She said he doesn't speak, only watches, always just before something happens. The first body that turned up in Wapping. She knew it was coming. She said he'll cough for the last time tonight, and he did. Holmes paced again. Then we are now not merely solving a mystery, but racing against a pattern. One that follows logic only from inside its own rules. Morgan looked near collapse. Am I going to die, Mr. Holmes? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, softly, not if I can stop it, he turned to me. Watson, tomorrow we return to the Royal Surgical College. This time, we are not asking about the present. We are going to search the past. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger the next morning. Gray and wet found Holmes and me standing before the iron gates of the Royal Surgical College, their black paint flaking like old blood. Inside, the building had the somber hush of a place accustomed to secret. The long corridors echoed with our footsteps as we made our way toward the archival wing. Holmes had already secured access through a terse letter penned to the acting head curator, invoking past favors and a quiet urgency. As we entered the archival chamber room lined with cedar cabinets and heavy ledgers, Holmes gave no pause for pleasantries. He moved directly to the far corner where records from the 1860s to the 1880s were kept under lock and low light. I followed, noting the strange smell that lingered in the air, not the usual scent of dust and binding glue, but something sharper, almost metallic. Holmes pulled 3 ledgers from the bottom shelves and laid them across the nearest table. For the next hour, we worked in silence, flipping through pages yellowed with time. It was tedious work lists of donors, anatomical parts, handwritten notes about muscle damage and bone preservation. But Holmes combed through them with a hunger I had come to recognize. He was not reading. He was tracking. Then, at last, he stopped. Here, he said quietly. Look at this entry, Watson. I leaned over. The script was difficult to decipher, but clear enough to read. Donation received the 4th of March, 1879. No name given. Contents sealed. Origin listed as Expedition Ashfall, Sudan region. Subject material stored in sublevel vault. Note: not to be unsealed without express permission of the board. Possible contamination or spiritual significance. Handle with caution. I looked up. Spiritual significance. Holmes's voice was low. In that era, it meant tribal artifacts, often treated with suspicion. But the date 1879 matches the age of the box Ransom reportedly discovered, and that's not a region I recognize. He flipped to the next page. A single line had been scrawled in red ink beneath the entry. Do not display. Bury again if opened. We both fell silent. The room suddenly felt colder. Holmes, I said, you don't believe this thing, the mask has power. Holmes glanced at me with an expression that was unreadable, then closed the ledger softly. Power, Watson, is often defined not by the object, but by the belief surrounding it. If enough people act under the influence of a fear, that fear becomes real enough to kill. We left the archives without further delay. Holmes was quiet as we walked deep in thought, until we reached the college's side garden, a small patch of green beside the east wing, mostly used for air during breaks. There we saw Miss Gray standing alone beside a bench. She did not appear surprised to see us. Holmes approached her with no preamble. Where is the mask now? She turned slowly. Her face, pale as before, held none of her former poise. Gone, she said. Taken by someone who doesn't wish it to be studied. Then why the theatrics? Holmes asked. The coughs, the scorch marks, the letter. Why make it seem like a haunting? She hesitated. To slow you down. Holmes tilted his head. Why would someone want to delay discovery? Miss Gray looked directly at him. Because they're preparing to use it. The words fell like stone into a well. I stepped forward. Use it. Use what? It's just a carved mask. No, she said. It's more than that. It's a memory. A relic of a rite that was meant to end with its burial. It carries not death, but instruction. A blueprint for fear. Whoever controls that controls the reaction. Holmes did not blink. Then someone is trying to engineer panic. Yes, she said. And they'll do it by making death seem supernatural. The coughing is a cue. The burn is a stamp. And the mask. The mask completes the illusion. She looked toward the street. They're going to stage another death soon. A final one. In public? Holmes turned instantly. Where? I don't know. But they left something behind. At Ransom's, in the cellar. We were already moving. The cab ride back to Dorian Lane was a blur. Holmes silent, his mind working at a ferocious pace. At the lodging house, Ransom was not home, but the landlady let us in, muttering about strange footsteps heard the night before. We made our way to the cellar, a narrow space beneath the stairs, cramped and cold. Holmes lit his lantern and scanned the floor. There, in the center, was a small wooden box, new, unsealed, and beside it a fresh scorch on the floorboards. Circular and pulsing faint heat. Holmes knelt and opened the box slowly. Inside was a strip of paper with a single word, tomorrow. He stood, eyes cold. Watson, he said, the game is about to turn violent. Someone intends to kill publicly and leave no explanation but fear. We must act before the mask appears again, or we shall all begin to cough. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The mood in Baker Street that evening was one of intense calculation. Holmes sat by the window, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the rooftops across the street, while the lamplight behind him cast his shadow long across the floor. The small wooden box from Ransom's cellar rested unopened on the table, its faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air. The word tomorrow, written inside it, had taken on a weight beyond its brevity, looming over every minute that passed. I watched Holmes with increasing unease, for although his stillness suggested calm, I could see the flickering behind his eyes. He was building something in his mind, piece by piece, and the moment of clarity was near. After nearly an hour of silence, he spoke without turning. "Watson, I believe we are being watched, not in the vulgar sense of a man behind a curtain, but studied, observed for our responses. Whoever controls this game is not merely trying to frighten us. They are measuring how long it takes us to understand." He rose slowly and paced the room, then turned to me. "I have formed a theory, and like all theories, it must now be tested, not in safety, but in the field." I asked, "Where do we go?" "To the place where fear spreads fastest," he said, "and where a theatrical death would have the greatest effect. A public museum, a place of knowledge turned to dread." By morning, Holmes had secured us entry to the anatomical exhibition hall at the Royal Surgical College. The building was not open to the public, the Dayan archivist had claimed. Plumbing issues, but Holmes had learned that a private lecture had been scheduled regardless. Attendees would include medical students, donors, and a few reporters. "A perfect stage," he muttered as we approached the great iron doors. "Not for science, but for spectacle." Inside the hall was being prepared. A long display table stood at the front, and behind it, several glass cases containing preserved organs, skeletal fragments, and labeled specimens. Among the attendees was none other than Mr. Alec Morgan, whose hands shook as he set down the ledgers. When he saw us, his face blanched. Holmes approached him directly. "Has the mask been delivered here?" he asked. Morgan nodded once. "Yes, in a crate marked unclassified ethnographic materials. I thought it was routine, until I opened it. It was the same as before, only darker, more worn." "Where is it now?" Holmes asked. "In the preparation room, but someone's moved it. It's not in the crate anymore." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we have little time." We moved quickly through the service corridor to the back of the hall, where a smaller room housed the display materials not yet brought to the main exhibit. It was cold and silent. On the table at the center sat a polished stand, the kind used to display busts or skulls. But the stand was empty. "There," Holmes said, pointing. On the floor, just beneath the pedestal, lay a scorch mark, fresh, like the others, oval-shaped and faintly warm. But this one was accompanied by something new, a trail of ash, small as dust, leading toward the stage doors. "Watson," Holmes said, "we are being led again. But this time, I intend to follow with purpose." He turned sharply and called for one of the college's attendants. "Inform the event host there has been a fire hazard discovered. Delay the lecture 10 minutes. Say nothing more." The man nodded and hurried off. Holmes turned back to me, face grave. "They will strike during the lecture. The mask will be placed where all can see, and the victim already marked will fall. The message will be simple: knowledge cannot protect you." I felt a chill. "And who is the target?" "That," Holmes said, "is what I intend to find out now." We returned to the main hall as guests began arriving. Miss Gray entered quietly, keeping to the edges, while Dr. Thwaite arrived last, despite still being under suspicion. He took a seat in the front row, nodding stiffly to Morgan. Holmes's gaze swept the room, then landed on a tall, unfamiliar man standing near the back dark coat, and a stillness that unsettled the very air around him that Holmes whispered, "Is the listener." I looked, and indeed the man did not move. He made no attempt to speak, no adjustment of collar or coat. He simply watched. Holmes moved toward him, slow and deliberate. As he drew near, the man turned his head ever so slightly. Their eyes made tanned in that instant. Something passed between them that I could not interpret. Holmes said nothing. The man did not speak. Then Holmes turned and returned to me. "We cannot stop the attempt," he said softly, "but we can interrupt it. I need you to distract the room. In exactly 5 minutes, ask Dr. Thwaite a question about the Ashfall expedition, loudly. It will force the others to turn, and when they do, I'll be where I need to be." "Holmes," I said, "what are you going to do?" He smiled faintly. "Interfere with the illusion. They are not expecting improvisation." When the moment came, I stood as instructed and loudly addressed Dr. Thwaite. "Doctor," I said, "could you speak to the donation made in 1879, the one labeled the expedition?" There was a sharp intake of breath from several in the room. Miss Gray stood, stunned. Thwaite froze, eyes darting toward the podium where Holmes now stood, holding something in a black cloth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "this object was to be revealed to you today. I am sorry to disappoint, but it is not what you were led to believe." He pulled the cloth aside to reveal the mask, charred, grooved, glistening with an oily sheen. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Holmes held it aloft, then threw it into a waiting iron basin and poured water over it. The mask hissed and cracked, then shattered. The cough came. Once, from the rear of the room, the listener was gone. Holmes stepped down from the stage. "It was never about the mask," he said, voice firm. "It was about the fear it represented. That fear was meant to spread today. It no longer can." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again that night. Baker Street was quiet, but not with peace. It was the heavy quiet of restraint, like breath held before the next plunge. Holmes sat in his chair, motionless except for his fingers, which drummed lightly on the armrest. I knew this rhythm. It was his way of measuring time against tension. The mask had been destroyed, yes, but Holmes remained unconvinced that the danger had passed. "We interrupted the performance," he said at last, voice low, "but the actor behind it is still waiting in the wings. And he will not wait long." I stared into the fire, uneasy. "Then we've only delayed him." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. What we witnessed at the college was not the final blow. It was a rehearsal, a staging ground. But the man we saw, the listener, was not their leader. He was a hand, a signal. Someone else directs this illusion. And now, with the mask removed from play, they will be forced to strike in a different way. Desperation always leaves sharper marks." The words had barely passed when a knock broke the silence. It was sharp, frantic. I opened the door to find Alec Morgan standing there, drenched in rain, his spectacles cracked and his hand clutching his side. He looked like he had run through a storm, and perhaps something worse. "They tried," he gasped, "tonight. At my flat." Holmes helped him in, settled him on the settee, and fetched a cloth to press against the blood seeping from a shallow cut near his ribs. It was not deep, but fresh and intentional. "Tell me exactly what happened," Holmes said calmly. Morgan shivered. "I returned home after the college lecture. I felt watched on the way, but saw no one. When I entered my rooms, the windows were open. I never left them that way. And on the table, there was a scorch mark, new, still hot, as if someone had just been there." "And the injury?" I asked. I turned to leave, and someone was waiting just outside the doortol, coat pulled tight. I didn't see his face. He said nothing, just stepped forward and cut me clean, just enough to warn. Then he disappeared into the alley. Holmes pressed the cloth tighter. "And did he cough?" Morgan blinked. "No, but I did." Holmes froze for just a second. "You?" Morgan nodded. "Only once. I don't know why. My throat just ... tightened." Holmes stood and paced to the window. "It has begun to spread. The symbol is no longer dependent on the object. Fear is now carrying it." I looked at him. "Are you saying Morgan's cough wasn't a symptom, but a suggestion?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "He saw the sign. He was marked. The mind filled in the rest. That is the genius of it. The illusion has grown strong enough that its victims fulfill it, like a story they've been taught to believe." A deep silence fell over the room. Then Holmes turned back. "We must now do what they do not expect. We stop chasing the mask. We chase the author." He reached for his files again, sorting quickly until he found a letter sealed in old blue wax. "This," he said, handing it to me, "was from the late Dr. Marlowe, a former expedition leader whose records were mysteriously removed from the college's archives. Before his death, he sent me this, asking me to investigate strange patterns of panic within 3 European cities, each following the arrival of a cultural object from North Africa." I opened the letter. It was brief, almost a whisper. "They follow the ash, always the ash. It leaves no trace but belief. When it reawakens, it will not need me." I looked up. "You think this is the same hand?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Not a hand, a method, passed from mind to mind, cultivated. The listener is just a vessel. There is someone else, someone who has learned how to create terror by design, and they are not finished." He pulled out a map of London and marked 3 locations: Ransom's flat, Morgan's rooms, and the college. "There's a triangle forming each point, touched by the illusion. And if I'm correct, the next will be the one furthest from scrutiny." I followed his gaze to the lower corner of the triangle. "The museum," I said. Holmes nodded. "The City Museum of Anthropological History. Closed for refurbishment, but the perfect setting. Forgotten rooms, quiet hallways. And tonight, a gathering of trustees for a private preview of their latest acquisitions. Are we invited?" I asked. "No," Holmes said, already pulling on his coat. "But I do not intend to knock." We arrived at the museum just before midnight. The building loomed tall and quiet, a single gas lamp flickering by the side entrance. Holmes produced a narrow key, slid it into the lock, and we slipped inside. The halls were still, glass cases like coffins glinting in the dim light. Holmes moved with surety, guiding us past the main exhibits toward a narrow corridor marked Restoration. As we reached the end, voices rose ahead, men speaking in hushed tones, their words too blurred to catch. Holmes pulled me aside. "Wait here. If I'm wrong, you'll know soon enough." "If I'm right," a dry cough echoed from the hall. "Not ours." We turned the corner. But the corridor was empty, except for a single case, and inside it the mask, whole again, despite being shattered. Hours earlier, Holmes froze. "This is not possible," he whispered, and from behind us a voice spoke, quiet and cold. "Impossibility is the final tool of fear." We turned. The listener was there, but this time he spoke. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. We stood frozen beneath the museum's flickering gaslight, the walls pressing in with cold stillness as the words hung in the air like a blade suspended by thread. Impossibility is the final tool of fear. The listener, no longer mute, stepped forward with the slow, careful poise of a man who had waited a long time to be noticed. He was taller than I remembered, though perhaps it was the confidence that gave him height. His face, pale and angular, bore no malice-only certainty, as if everything happening had been written in advance. Holmes did not move. I could feel the tension in him, tightly wound but withheld, like a trap waiting for the proper moment. The listener's eyes moved over Holmes, then to me. "You've been clever," he said, his voice smooth like paper over stone. "You broke the stage before the play could begin, but you never understood the audience." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "I understand them perfectly," he said. "They crave meaning in fear. You offer it to them shaped like ritual, sealed in secrecy, delivered through illusion. You've built not just a legend, but a mechanism." The man smiled faintly. "Words, so many words, and yet none of them change what people see. They saw the mask, they heard the cough, they felt the mark. That is all they remember. You destroyed it. Yes, but it has returned. Why?" I looked to the glass case again. The mask was wholly identical in every groove, every scratch, every line of age. And yet I had seen Holmes shatter it with my own eyes. It had hissed and cracked and turned to ash. How could it be here, now untouched? Holmes stepped closer to the case. "You replaced it," he said. "Crafted another. The original was never the key, was the idea of the original. That is what you carry. And now you intend to let it be seen again." The listener gave a slow nod. They were going to forget, all of them. Their little rational world was reassembling. But if the mask reappears, if another dies in its presence, ... they'll believe it never broke, I finished, the weight of it dawning on me. The man's smile did not change. "Belief doesn't care for only symbols." Holmes turned to him fully now. "Why? You've gone to tremendous lengths. Lives have been taken. A pattern spread through fear. What do you gain?" For the first time, the listener's voice shifted. It grew quiet, near more. "I was part of the expedition," he said. "Ashfall, Sudan, 1879. We found the mask buried in the sand beneath the ruins of a collapsed shrine. It was locked in a wooden box and sealed with copper bands. There were carvings we could not read. The locals fled the site before sundown. But we," he stopped, briefly, "we did not listen. We unearthed it, carried it home." Holmes studied him, and "We thought it was superstition," the man said, "until the first man died. No wounds, no poison, just a breath stolen in silence. Then another, and another. Always the same, always alone, always after the coughing began." We didn't believe, even then. But when I coughed, I knew. He took a breath. The others are gone. I am what remains. And now you want the world to share your madness? Holmes asked, his voice sharp. The listener shook his head. No, I want the world to know it is real. Because it is. Even if the deaths were man-made, the fear is not. It is older than the mask, older than speech. It's been waiting for a name. I've given it one. Holmes stepped forward. What name? The man said nothing, but the coughing began again. Not from him, from behind us. I turned sharply on, saw Alec Morgan, stumbling into the corridor, eyes wide, hands clutching his throat. He gasped once, then fell to his knees. Holmes rushed forward, catching him just as he collapsed. I knelt beside them, checking his pulse. Still there, weak but steady. He's alive, I said, but barely. The listener remained still. That was his choice. He opened the second box, the one left for him. He needed to see it again. Holmes stood slowly. You gave him the trigger. Let the fear finish the work. The man looked tired now. I don't have to kill anyone, Holmes. I just have to show them what they already dread. Once they believe, their own minds do the rest. Holmes moved swiftly then. In one motion, he pulled a small vial from his coat and hurled it at the mask's glass case. The vial shattered on impact, releasing a sharp hiss and thick white smoke. I coughed as the fumes clouded the hall, and the listener stumbled backward, coughing to dot. When the air cleared, the case was empty. Holmes held the mask in his hands, and he was burning it again. This time with oil, this time until nothing remained. The listener tried to rush forward, but I stepped between them. Enough, Holmes said. The illusion dies with this. You cannot keep creating what no longer carries belief. But the man only looked at the rising smoke and said softly, I already did. And then he vanished into the shadows of the hall. We searched for hours, but he was gone. Holmes stood over the ashes long after the fire died. Not the end, he said at last, but the unraveling has begun. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. The fire had long since faded, but the air in the museum still tasted of ash. The mask, what remained of it, had burned down to flakes that crumbled between Holmes's fingers as he knelt beside the iron basin, silent and distant. Morgan, still unconscious but breathing steadily, had been taken by constables, summoned discreetly by Holmes after the listener disappeared. And now, as the dawn began to paint the tops of London's rooftops with grey light, we returned to Baker Street. Holmes said nothing the entire way, only held his gloves in his hands and stared ahead with that particular stillness he wore when all the lines of a puzzle had nearly converged. Once inside, he moved directly to the bureau and began to write, not in his notebook, but in the small bound ledger he reserved for private correspondence. When I asked whom the letter was for, he simply said, a man who owes me a favor in the Foreign Office. If we are to lure a ghost, Watson, we must speak with the men who traffic in silence. Then he handed the envelope to Mrs. Hudson, with instructions for its immediate dispatch. I stood by the fireplace, watching the smoke drift upward. Do you believe he'll strike again? I asked. The listener. Holmes looked up from his writing and gave a faint smile. He already has. Not with fire or blade, but with suggestion. There will be panic now, among those who saw the mask twice, once destroyed, once whole again. Some will believe it was never burned. Some will say it changed hands. A few, perhaps, will say it changed form. What matters is that they speak of it. That is how it spreads. And we've done nothing but feed it, I said bitterly. Not quite, Holmes replied. Because we still hold one thing he does not. I frowned. What's that? Holmes turned toward the shelves, withdrew an old brass key, and held it up. Control of the narrative. Before I could ask more, a knock came at the door. This time it was Miss Gray, pale but composed, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Holmes offered her a seat without ceremony. She took it and said nothing for a moment. Then she looked directly at Holmes. You've made yourself a target. I was one from the moment I broke the first illusion. Holmes replied calmly. She reached into her coat and removed a small paper packet, placing it on the table. This was sent to me last night. No name, just a courier. Inside it was this. Holmes opened the packet and revealed a black thread short, fine, and curled slightly at the edges. A scent of smoke still clung to it. Holmes inspected it under the lamp and then nodded. Same material as the mask's original interior lining, he said, but older, more brittle. Miss Gray sat forward. I think they're trying to remind me where I came from. Holmes glanced at her. You were with the Ashfall expedition, weren't you? She hesitated, then nodded. Not as a scientist. I was the daughter of a linguist who joined late in the venture. I was 16. They told me not to speak of what I saw, and for years I didn't. But the listener, he was one of the porters. Not a scholar, not a soldier, just someone who listened to what the locals said. He believed them when none of the rest did. And now, Holmes asked, he wants the world to believe what he does. Not through proof, but through repetition. Holmes nodded slowly. Which is why we must now change the story. He rose and moved to his desk, pulling out a slim black case. Inside were 2 thin lenses, wires, and a fold of painted latex. As I leaned in, I realized what he was preparing, a disguise. He turned to me. We're going to hold a gathering. At the college 3 nights from now. An academic lecture anonymous in name, but highly advertised. A rediscovery of the Ashfall mask. Word will reach him. I stepped back. You're going to pretend it still exists? No, Holmes said. I'm going to pretend he has already won, that the mask has returned, and no one will dare stop it. I'll pose as the curator, his own reflection of the past. And when he comes to witness the triumph of his illusion, I will show him the flaw in his design. Miss Gray leaned forward. You're drawing him out. Holmes nodded. But not just him. His entire circle. The listener was never working alone. The marks, the threats, the timing, it was too coordinated. Someone is protecting him. Perhaps several someones. They will come to see the world bend. And what if they come armed? I asked quietly. Then we shall answer them with light, Holmes said, and truth, the one thing that kills illusions faster than fire. The next 3 days passed in silence and preparation. Holmes worked closely with college officials to secure the hall, while sending notices through underground channels, coded publications, and whispered networks that dealt in antiquities and forbidden knowledge. The bait was not the object, it was the invitation. A performance where fear was expected to win, but Holmes intended to change the ending. The night of the gathering arrived. The room was dim, the seats full, the air buzzing with tension. A covered case sat at the center of the display table, though it contained nothing but soot and wire. Holmes, now disguised with gray hair and thick spectacles, stood beside it, his manner quiet, his posture humble. I watched from the wings, along with Miss Gray, who had volunteered to signal any movement among the crowd. And then, just before Holmes could speak, a single cough echoed from the upper aisle. Not loud, not dry, but deliberate. Holmes lifted his eyes and smiled. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Cough drifted through the air like smoke, and every head in the lecture hall turned. It was not loud, but it landed with weight, as though rehearsed, and I could feel the ripple it sent through the assembled audience. A few leaned forward in their seats, others whispered behind gloved hands. Holmes, still wearing the guise of an aging curator, did not move. He kept his hands resting on the covered case, his eyes calm behind the thick lenses. I stood at the side of the room with Miss Gray, watching carefully as the door near the back opened a fraction wider and a figure slipped inside. The listener. There was no mistaking him now. His coat was the same, long and dark, and he moved, not with stealth, but with solemn intent. Like a priest entering a sacred space, he did not sit. He stood near the back, just enough in shadow to keep his face partially hidden, but not so far that Holmes couldn't see him. And see him Holmes did. His posture straightened subtly, not with surprise, but with something closer to welcome. An expected guest finally arrived. I noticed Holmes's left hand adjust slightly on the table, 3 fingers tapping once, then again. A signal, Miss Gray responded, by slipping toward the hall doors to secure them. The trap, if one could call it that, had now begun to close. Holmes cleared his throat gently and began to speak. His voice aged and slow, but clearly projected. What we have here, he said, tapping the box beside him, is not merely an object of ritual, nor a relic of anthropology. It is a mirror, one that shows men not what they are, but what they fear they might be. He let the words hang, then continued. Recovered from the ruins of Ashfall in 1879, sealed in copper, buried beneath both sand and silence. This item has inspired decades of speculation and superstition, and tonight it has returned. The room held its breath. I saw it in the way even the most skeptical guests stared forward, their eyes fixed on the covered object. The tension was no longer just about fear of the mask, it was fear of the confirmation that it existed. Holmes lifted a hand slowly and touched the drape covering the case, letting his fingers curl around its edge. But he didn't pull it away. Instead, he looked toward the back of the halt award, the listener, and tilted his head just slightly. Would anyone like to confess before we proceed? He asked softly. There was silence. Then a voice answered from the back, calm, familiar, the listener's. No one confesses when they believe the truth is behind glass. Holmes smiled. Ah, but there's the error. The truth is never under glass. It's in the shadows behind it. At that moment, the side doors opened again quietly, but with purpose, and Lestrade stepped inside with 2 plainclothes men, each moving toward the exits. They didn't move to arrest, not yet. They were waiting. Holmes turned back to the box. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, there is no mask inside this case. What lies here is ash and wire. I destroyed the mask twice, once by hand, once by history. And yet you all came. Why? No one answered. Holmes's voice shifted, sharpening. Because you brought it back. Not with ships or shrines, but with stories, with whispered warnings, with coughs in the night and scorch marks placed just so. The real object was never carved. It was taught. You were all taught to fear it. There was movement near the back, now two men rising from their seats, glancing at the listener. He did not move, but he knew. Holmes's voice did not falter. The listener is not your leader. He is your echo. The real architect of this illusion is someone else. Someone who understood long ago that fear does not need fire. It only needs a pattern. And once that pattern enters enough minds, well, the deaths need no longer be committed. They simply ... happen. A gasp came from the left side of the room. Someone had fainted. Another guest backed away from their seat. But Holmes remained still. I learned the final piece 2 nights ago, he said, when Morrigan coughed. Not because he was touched or marked, but because he expected to be. That was the true brilliance of your design. You taught men to manifest the very symptoms they feared. A performance so powerful that it needed no actor. The listener stepped forward then, at last. He removed his coat slowly, deliberately, and set it over the railing. Beneath it, he wore the same dark attire as before, simple, clean, unremarkable. His voice was quiet. You cannot unwrite what people have already accepted. Holmes smiled. No, but I can reveal who wrote it. With a sharp nod to Lestrade, the inspector moved forward. The 2 men who had stood earlier tried to slip away, but the plainclothes officers intercepted them. One of them, a man with a clipped accent and an ivory-handled cane, fought briefly, then stilled. Holmes approached and removed the man's coat collar. Inside, sewn into the lining, was a page of parchment marked with ash, signed in the name of a false expedition. Colonel Roderick Vale, Holmes said, former intelligence officer, dismissed for involvement in irregular colonial operations. You created the legend of the mask after the Ashfall site. You placed it in museums, in collections, even in dreams. And when belief faded, you reignited it through theater, through fear, through others. Vale said nothing. Lestrade took him by the arm and led him away. The listener remained. Holmes looked at him. You believed it too, didn't you? The man nodded. I still do. Holmes stepped closer. Then be free of it. The story is no longer yours to carry. We've replaced it with truth. The listener didn't answer. He turned and walked out, not as a villain, but as a man who had simply been to belong inside a lie. The room was silent. Holmes turned back to the crowd, and for the first time that night, there was no cough. Chapter 13, the final attempt to escape it was well past midnight when the lecture hall finally emptied. The last murmurs fading into the corridors. Holmes remained seated at the front, his disguise now discarded, the wire-framed spectacles resting beside him on the lectern. I had never seen him so still after a climax. Usually, his energy returned in bursts of violin or tobacco, a restless mind released from strain. But now, he seemed weighed down by something not yet spoken on, unease, still, pulsing beneath the neat unraveling of the evening's events. I stood nearby, watching as Lestrade finished directing his men and escorting the arrested agents through the side door. The colonel had not spoken since his exposure. Not a word. He had simply stared at Holmes, as though memorizing the man who had ended his invention. Miss Grey remained too, seated in the second row. She had watched the listener leave in silence, eyes fixed on his back, as though it would vanish if she blinked. She had said nothing during the reveal, but now she approached Holmes slowly and sat beside him. The air was different now, as if the room itself were reluctant to return to the ordinary. "It's not over, is it?" she asked softly. Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. The structure has fallen, but the scaffolding remains. Someone else will try to lift it again. It may not be the listener. It may not even be one of the men arrested tonight. But stories do not die so easily once they've been told, especially when fear has already given them breath." Lestrade returned then, tugging his gloves tight as he walked toward us. "We've got Vale in custody, and his 2 men will talk soon enough. We found papers, sketches of the mask, symbols, fake death certificates. A whole operation designed to keep the illusion alive. If I hadn't seen it unfold myself, I'd have called it madness." Holmes stood. "It was madness, Inspector, but of a very disciplined variety, carefully constructed. His genius wasn't in invention, it was in restraint. He knew how little was needed to provoke the imagination." Lestrade gave a small grunt. "Well, I imagine we'll be cleaning up the threads for months. But you've done your part again." We prepared to leave, Holmes gathering his notes and motioning for me to carry the ash-filled basin. He paused before exiting the hall and looked back once, not at the crowd or the stage, but at the space where the listener had stood. "I don't trust silence anymore," he said quietly. We stepped out into the wet street. The night fog curling around the gas lamps like smoke that had refused to die. It was nearly 2 o'clock, and Baker Street felt impossibly distant. But Holmes did not hail a cab. Instead, he walked with unusual slowness, his mind still sifting through shadows, even though the light had already come. It was not until we were halfway home that we saw the figure waiting beneath the awning of a closed bookshop. He did not speak. He stepped forward, reaching into his coat knot with a weapon, but with a box, small, black, familiar. Holmes froze. I stepped in front of him, but Holmes touched my arm. "Let him," he said. The man opened the box slowly, revealing not a mask, not ash, but a piece of cloth folded neatly in quarters. When Holmes reached for it, the man whispered, "This one never burned." Holmes unfolded the cloth. Inside was a thread, identical to the one Miss Grey had shown us. Another thread, another seed. The man tall, thin, with a mark on his cheekbone, like an old brand, turned and disappeared into the alley before we could move. Holmes stood motionless, staring at the thread for a long time. "He's one of Vale's," I said. Holmes shook his head. "No, he's new, a disciple. The story has found another voice." We returned to Baker Street, the box still unopened in Holmes's hand. He placed it on the mantel next to the old Stradivarius, and did not speak for nearly an hour. Then, without turning, he said, "Fear is not content with survival. It seeks to grow. It attaches to those willing to be vessels. We destroyed a lie tonight, but not the need for it." I sat across from him, watching the coals dim. "And what will you do with the thread?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "I'll keep it as a reminder." I waited for him to say more, but But he rose and pulled the curtains shut. Then he struck a match, lit his pipe, and walked to the window outside. The night remained still, but somewhere in the fog, I thought I heard a cough dot, or perhaps I only imagined it. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The morning after the encounter, beneath the awning, came slowly, gray and soundless, as though the city itself were hesitating to breathe. I found Holmes, already awake, seated at the breakfast table, the unopened black box resting beside his cup. He had not touched the tea Mrs. Hudson had brought, nor had he spoken since rising. Instead, he simply stared at the cloth-wrapped thread, his fingers unmoving, the ash-stained parcel unburned and undisturbed. It was unlike him to let an object remain untouched when curiosity burned so fiercely behind his eyes. But something about the thread, its quiet threat, its familiar simplicities, to demand reverence, or perhaps restraint. When I finally broke the silence, it was with a question that had gnawed at me through the night. Holmes, why not destroy it? If this thread is a symbol, if it's part of the illusion, shouldn't we end it here completely? He looked at me then, not surprised by the question. If I burn it now, Watson, he said, I do what they expect. I become part of their ritual. Fire, silence, fear. That's the path they've laid. But if I preserve it, not with reverence, but with logic, I can study it without submitting to it. I frowned. You mean to use it? Holmes's eyes narrowed. I mean to understand it. Somewhere in this thread is the key to how the illusion spreads, not just from man to man, but from fear to form. It's a carrier, a message encoded in simplicity. He rose and walked to the shelves, removing a thick volume of colonial field reports, one I recognized from earlier in the case, the compiled accounts of expeditions lost and recovered. He flipped quickly through its pages until he stopped at a sketch. He held it up for me to see. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. A series of threads intertwined and buried within the lining of a ceremonial shroud. The notes beside it were faded, but the term breath marker was still legible. This, Holmes said, tapping the page, is from an unrelated expedition. 1865. A different continent, a different culture, and yet the same object appears. Not a mask, but threads, left behind deliberately after the death of a tribal elder. The locals believed these threads carried memory, voice, breath. You're saying it's a recurring myth, I said. A universal image. Holmes nodded. Which means someone very clever recognized the pattern long before the Ashfall mask was ever unearthed. The listener was merely the latest, but Vale he knew the history. He stitched those ancient beliefs into something new, something modern. But even he wasn't the beginning. He closed the book slowly. There's another name, one we've heard only once. Ransom mentioned it in his earliest letters to the college. A name buried among the expedition's suppliers. A man who funded the crates, the transport, and the first exhibition room at the museum. He never went to Ash. He stayed here in London, behind the scenes. I sat up straighter. Who? Holmes walked to his desk and removed a letter from a folder marked Curatorial Records. He handed it to me. The paper was thick and brittle, the ink smudged in places. The signature at the bottom read, Erasmus Finch. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's expression had hardened. He's not a scholar, Holmes said. He's a collector, a man who has appeared across several auction records in the last 3 decades, always under aliases, sometimes as a buyer, sometimes as a silent benefactor, but always present when artifacts were shrouded in ritual or mystery. The listener, veil, even ransom, they were players. But Finch was the architect. But we've seen no sign of him, I said. Exactly, Holmes replied, because he no longer needs to appear. His creation lives on through fear alone. He has reached the final phase of his design, invisibility. At that moment, Miss Gray entered the sitting room, her coat wet from rain and her face unusually pale. She held a telegram in her hand, folded and crumpled. "This came for me," she said, voice low. "No name, but it mentions Finch." Holmes took the telegram and read it silently. Then he read it again. I saw his brow tighten, though his lips did not move. "What does it say?" I asked. He turned the paper toward me. "F will appear one final time. South window, midnight. Come alone, or it ends in silence." Holmes set the telegram down. "The south window," he murmured. "That would be the museum. The lecture hall. Surely it's a trap," I said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes said. "But it is also an invitation. The final thread is being pulled." Miss Gray stepped forward. "You're not going alone." Holmes gave her a brief look. "No, I won't. Not truly. But Finch must believe that I am." The rest of the day was spent in quiet preparation. Holmes composed 2 letters, one to Lestrade and the other to the head of the museum, requesting the hall remain accessible but unstaffed for the night. As evening fell, he packed a small satchel with a notebook, a sealed envelope, and the thread still wrapped in cloth, slipped it into his coat. At 1:15 midnight. We arrived outside the museum. Holmes instructed me to enter through the basement entrance and wait just beyond the stage wall. Miss Gray would remain by the rear stairwell. Holmes would walk through the front alone. I watched him disappear into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the great iron doors. The last thing he said to me before he went inside was this: "Fear thrives in silence, Watson. But tonight we speak." Chapter 15. The final gathering. The museum was darker than I remembered it, every corner holding a breath that had not yet exhaled. I moved quietly through the basement corridor as instructed, the narrow passage lit only by the dim glow of my pocket lantern. Above me, the wood and stone of the lecture hall stretched like the bones of something ancient, and every creak beneath my feet seemed to echo far too loud. Miss Gray had taken her position at the back stairs, a revolver hidden beneath her coat, and her instructions memorized. I crept toward the wings of the hall and pressed myself behind the old velvet curtain that lined the edge of the stage. From there I could see the south window, tall, arched, and black against the night sky. Holmes entered through the main doors just before midnight. His steps were measured, slow, his coat damp from the evening mist. The hall was empty of audience, but not of presence. Something else was there, not visible, but unmistakable. I could feel it even from where I stood in expectancy, as though the walls themselves waited to listen. Holmes moved to the center of the hall and stood directly beneath the south window, the telegram still folded in his hand. He did not call out. He simply waited. Several minutes passed. The wind outside picked up slightly, tapping the glass with a soft, repetitive whisper. Then a figure appeared. He did not enter through any door. He was simply there, standing in the aisle, a tall man in a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in deep shadow. He moved with precision, not slow, not hurried, but deliberate. Holmes did not turn as the man approached. "Erasmus Finch," Holmes said quietly. The man stopped 2 paces from him. "That is the name you've chosen for me." Holmes turned to face him now. "It's the one that's signed on the shipping manifests, on the ledgers from Ash, on the original catalogue of the Mask before it was renamed. And more importantly, it's the name whispered by every man you recruited, manipulated or erased. Ransom, Vale, the listener." Finch did not deny it. He tilted his head slightly, as if observing something curious in Holmes's face. "You've done well," he said. "You traced the roots of the tree, but the shadow it casts do. You understand that, Holmes. I understand that you turned ancient fear into modern theater," Holmes replied. "You created a deathless myth, not by proving it true, but by orchestrating belief." Finch gave a small smile. "Myths are just truths that lack evidence, until someone gives them a stage." Holmes stepped forward, unafraid. "But you made one mistake. You believed that fear would always obey the shape you gave it. You forgot that fear, like thought, evolves, and you've lost control of it." Finch said nothing. Holmes reached into his coat and removed the black thread, still wrapped in its cloth. "You left this," he said, "a seed. You thought I would burn it. Repeat the ritual. Complete your pattern. But I didn't." He held the cloth open. The thread gleamed faintly in the moonlight, filtering through the window. Finch looked at it, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only stillness. Holmes continued. "You wanted fear to pass hand to hand, word to word, until the story no longer needed you. But now the story has you. You are the last breath it has left." For a long moment, Finch was silent. Then he said, "So what will you do, Holmes? Arrest me, publish your findings, burn this, and claim victory?" Holmes's voice was quiet but steady. "No, I'll expose you, and then I'll let the silence fall. Not the theatrical kind you've orchestrated, but real silence. The kind that comes when no one listens anymore." Finch stepped forward, just slightly. "And what if no one believes your version?" Holmes smiled faintly. "They will, because your story depends on hiding in the cracks. Mine brings light to them." Suddenly, the doors at the rear of the hall opened. Lestrade entered with 2 officers. Miss Grey followed, her face pale but resolved. Finch did not move as they approached. He did not resist. Instead, he simply raised his hands and looked at Holmes once more. "You never feared the cough," he said softly. Holmes met his gaze. "Because it never belonged to the dead, only to those desperate to be believed." They took Finch into custody without struggle. As he passed me on the way out, I stepped out from the curtain and met his eyes for a brief moment. There was no madness there, nor guilt, only something cold, pride. When the hall was empty again, Holmes stood beneath the window once more. I joined him, and for a while we said nothing. Then he handed me the cloth. "Burn it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, let it rest. Not as fear, not as mystery, but as history." He walked away slowly, leaving the box behind on the lectern. The air felt different now. Not light, but cleared, as if something long pressing against the walls had finally receded. outside. The wind had stopped, and for the first time in days, no one coughed. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. We returned to Baker Street in the earliest hours of the morning, the city still cloaked in gray mist and thin light from flickering lamps. Holmes moved with an almost meditative calm, his steps slower than usual, not from exhaustion, but from a deep inward stillness. I had seen him like this before, on rare occasions, after a case where the solution wasn't simply a name or motive, but a philosophy unraveled. There was no violin tonight, no monologue, no triumphant burst of energy, just silence. Holmes sat by the fire, lit a single pipe, and motioned for me to sit. Then, at last, he began to speak. The brilliance of Erasmus Finch, he said, was not that he killed without being signed, but that he made others believe death could arrive without a cause. No poison, no bullet, just a cough in the dark, a mark on the floor, and silence. It was the presentation of fear not, the act of harm that allowed him to work so freely. He paused, tapping ash into the tray. That is why it was so difficult to trace, because it wasn't the actions that mattered, it was the effects. I leaned forward. So Ransom Morrigan, the man found in Wapping, they weren't just victims. They were audience. Exactly, Holmes said. Finch curated his victims, not for vengeance or hatred, but for resonance. Each man selected had access to knowledge or proximity to it. They were chosen because they could serve as believable conduits for a myth. And once the myth was in motion, it required very little maintenance. A mark here, a box, a cough in a hallway. That's all it took. But the deaths, I said. Some did die. Holmes nodded solemnly. Yes, and I believe some were helped along. Finch and his men would ensure that, when the myth needed reinforcement, someone collapsed. Quiet poisons interrupted airways. The suggestion of panic amplified by timing. The body of the man in Wapping, no signs of struggle, no wounds, but he had been inhaling chloroform-laced air, likely from a hidden source planted ahead of time, enough to still the breath, subtle enough to escape notice. I felt a chill, remembering the odd sweetness Holmes had noticed on the stairs of Ransom's lodgings, and the scorch marks. Another illusion, Holmes said. Some were created using magnesium strips embedded into wood and ignited to leave a perfect oval. Others were made with chemical compounds that simulate heat marks. Finch's team were not simply believers, they were artisans of effect. Every burn was deliberate, every detail positioned to provoke. He stood and retrieved a small notebook from his desk, the one he'd been filling, quietly through each stage of the investigation. It all comes back to Ashfall, but not in the way we were meant to believe. That expedition did uncover something remains, relics, pieces of a civilization that had long buried its fears in ritual. But Finch saw more than history. He saw opportunity. He wasn't a man trying to honor the past. He was trying to rewrite it in the minds of the living. And the mask, a prop, Holmes said. Powerful, yes, but not essential. He could have used any object. The mask was simply theatrical. It had the right shape, the right age. He ensured its rediscovery in public collections. Ensured it changed hands enough times that its origin became vague, and then inserted the myth like a splinter into memory. And the listener, I asked. A believer, Holmes replied, but not a liar. I think In some twisted way, he truly thought the mask carried power, that it had witnessed something ancient, something sacred. Finch needed a vessel to carry that faith, and so he let it settle in the man who would watch and whisper and deliver. I sat back, absorbing the layers. It had all seemed so intangible, so deliberately unreal. And yet Holmes, with the same quiet precision he applied to footprints and bloodstains, had dismantled the entire illusion and revealed the gears behind the ghost. Holmes turned, his gaze to the box on the mantel, the thread still untouched. "That," he said, "was never meant to kill. It was meant to linger." A final gesture. One last drop of ink on a story Finch believed might outlive him. "But it won't," I said. Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Not now. Because fear, when exposed to light, must transform, and I've replaced its ritual with explanation. That is all myth ever fears." We spent the rest of the morning compiling the full report. Lestrade would arrive later for Holmes's statement, and the museum board had already requested a private debrief. I watched as Holmes wrote with clarity and structure, no embellishment, no flourish. Just the sequence of logic as it had unfolded, each correction as the sun broke through the mist and filled the room with a pale warmth. Holmes set down his pen and said, "Watson, this case was not about murder. It was about meaning. And that is the most dangerous pursuit of all." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. And though the mask had burned, and the thread had not moved since the night Finch was taken, I could not help but listen to the creaks in the floorboards, the sigh of wind against glass, and the memory of that cough, not out of fear, but because I knew now what it meant. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days that followed were curiously calm, almost subdued, as if London itself were exhaling after having unknowingly held its breath. The newspapers caught hold of the story, though not in its full shape. Reports spoke of a secret society operating within academic circles, of psychological experiments gone too far, of staged hauntings and cruel manipulations. The word mask was mentioned only once, and cough not at all. Holmes had ensured that the most potent parts of the illusion would remain buried in ambiguity. It was not deception, he told me, but mercy. The truth, laid out in full to the public, would only risk a second wave of belief. He had severed the tale at its roots, and now he left it to rot unseen beneath the soil. Lestrade came twice to Baker Street. The first time was official, a request for testimony and final verification of the evidence collected. The second visit was less formal. He brought brandy and sat in Holmes's chair, uninvited but not unwelcome, shaking his head in slow admiration. "You know," he said, raising his glass, "if it weren't for the bruises on those men and the very real poison in Ransom's lamp, I'd swear this whole case was fiction." Holmes gave no reply, only puffed quietly at his pipe, eyes half closed. Erasmus Finch remained silent in custody. He refused legal counsel, answered no questions, and signed no documents. The magistrates called it a psychological breakdown, the culmination of delusional obsession. But Holmes disagreed. "Finch is not mad," he said to me later. "He's fulfilled. He created a story, fed it into the world, and watched it live without him. That was his goal. Even in prison, he believes he has succeeded." Yet Holmes knew better. The narrative was broken, now its ritual exposed. its silence pierced by truth. The story might be remembered, but it would never again be believed. Miss Gray disappeared from public view shortly after the final report was filed. Holmes received a single letter from her, postmarked from Paris. It was brief, composed in her usual careful hand. "Thank you. I have nothing more to carry." Holmes folded the letter without comment and placed it among his private correspondence. "She was part of the machinery," he said, "but not its maker. She healed now, in the way only people who have seen behind the curtain can." As for Alec Morgan, he recovered slowly, both in body and mind. The psychological scars remained the knowledge that he had been used, manipulated into fearing a death he never deserved. But Holmes saw to it that he was quietly reassigned to a position in Oxford, far from the surgical college and the whispers that still haunted its halls. "Let him file bones and dates," Holmes said. "It's the living myths that do the most harm." The Royal Surgical College closed its ethnographic wing for renovation. The official reason was structural repairs, though Holmes had quietly advised the board to retire certain items from public view, particularly those associated with the burned remnants of the mask, including the basin in which it had last been destroyed, were placed under sealed archive, inaccessible without multiple layers of approval. And the thread, the final symbol of the illusion, Holmes kept it in a drawer, wrapped tightly in its cloth, tucked among notes and sketches in a box marked False Histories. He never opened it again. One evening, as we sat in the firelit room, the case long behind us, Holmes spoke as if continuing a thought he had started hours before. "You know, Watson, fear is not always wicked. In the right hands, it's protective, an alarm." But Finch tried to shape it into something beautiful, something lasting. That was his flaw. I looked at him, unsure whether he pitied the man or loathed him. Holmes added, "There's nothing beautiful about control masquerading as wonder." I asked then the question I had been carrying for weeks. Do you think he believed in the mask? Truly, Holmes paused. "No," he said at last, "not in the object, but in the power of people to need it. That he believed in entirely, and in that belief, Finch had built his empire one cough, one mark, one whispered story at a time. It was over." Holmes returned to the hearth, the pipe still glowing faintly in his hand, though the smoke curled upward like the final vestige of a dream that would not quite leave the waking mind. The box marked False Histories remained where it had always been, nestled in the lowest drawer of the cabinet. He had not touched it since closing it earlier that day, but I knew, from the way his eyes kept drifting toward the mantel, that the thread still loomed in his thoughts. "You never quite believed in it," I said quietly. "Not even when the mask reappeared, not even when Morgan collapsed." Holmes took a moment before replying. "Belief is a word too easily used, Watson. I believe in patterns, in the way the mind clings to repetition, especially when afraid. When we lose the known, we seek meaning in the unexplained. A cough, a mark, a shadow, these are nothing on their own. But in the presence of expectation, they become symbols. The more people saw them, the more real they became, even to the healthy, even to the sane." He leaned forward, tapping ash from the bowl of his pipe into the tray, then stood and walked to the window. The glass was cold against his fingertips. Outside, The gaslight shimmered faintly in the mist, warping its reflection like a memory half remembered. Holmes spoke again, but this time his tone was less measured, almost wistful. "Do you recall the child's game, the one where they whisper a phrase down a line of children, each repeating it until, by the end, it bears no resemblance to the original?" "Of course," I said. "That is what Finch created, a myth that needed only to be misheard. He didn't need to prove the mask could kill. He only needed to suggest that something unseen could. The rest happened naturally. Human fear completed the equation." I felt a weight settle over the room. "But that makes it worse, Holmes. That means it's still possible, even now." Holmes turned toward me, a glint in his eye. "Only if we allow it. Only if we let silence reclaim what we've torn into light. The illusion depends on secrecy, on the absence of clarity. But the moment we walk others through its architecture, expose each beam, each rope, each shadow, it cannot support itself. It crumbles beneath the weight of logic." He walked back to the desk, drew open a drawer, and retrieved the copy of my manuscript he'd annotated earlier that week. Turning to the final pages, he tapped one paragraph near the end. "This, Watson. You must revise it." I leaned forward and read. The mask had been destroyed, its ashes scattered, its legend laid bare. The last mark had faded, and with it. I looked up. What should it say instead? Holmes thought for a long moment. "Say this: the mask was not the ending. It was the beginning of understanding." I scribbled the change into the margin, then closed the book softly. "I've often wondered," I said, "if stories like this can truly be forgotten, if the fear that shaped them ever really vanishes." Holmes nodded slowly. "No, Watson, they're never truly forgotten, but they lose their strength when they are understood. The human mind is a labyrinth built to preserve fear, because fear once meant survival, but now it must be tempered, brought into the light, not locked away." The fire cracked gently, and the silence between us took on a warmer hue. Outside, a distant clock struck midnight. Holmes reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed. He handed it to me without a word. I unfolded it carefully. It was one of the original expedition reports from Ashfall, the handwriting tight and urgent. But something had been added in a different inkneader, colder. To preserve belief, truth must be carefully thinned. To create fear, we must simply invite the eye to look and let the mind do the rest. "Finch's handwriting," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "I found it buried in the museum's donation archives. He wanted it, Reed. He left it there deliberately, a kind of last testament." I looked at the words again and felt the subtle sickness of how close they had come to succeeding, how delicately the illusion had been balanced, how nearly the city had fallen into mass belief. Holmes, seeing my expression, said gently, "You see, Watson, this case was never about a man. Not really. Finch could have been anyone. That is the true horror, because the method he used, selective truth, whispered fear, ritualized silence, these are available to anyone, and they are being used every day." He returned the letter to the drawer and shut it firmly. "But so long as we meet such methods, with reason, so long as there is even one voice willing to stand between belief and manipulation, then the story ends as it should." I stood and walked to the window, watching the lamplight stretch across Baker Street. What happens next? Holmes joined me. Next, the city forget. It moves on, as it always does. But we remember, not to fear it, but to recognize it if it ever returns. Finch believed the mask would outlive him. It won't. The room settled into silence again. This time, a silence that did not carry threat, only rest. I wrote the final words of my manuscript later that night, not as a tale of horror, or even as a case file, but as a parable of perception, a reminder of how close the human mind hovers above the unknown, and how easily it fills the dark with shape and voice and death. And as Holmes prepared for bed, extinguishing the last of the lamps, he looked to the mantel where the box had once sat and said, "Close the curtain, Watson. The theater is empty." And I did. With the gas lamps low and the windows shut against the London chill, I could still remember the first night, the sound behind the door, the soft, dry cough in the dark. I no longer feared it, but I remembered it, and perhaps that was Finch's truest victory, not terror, but memory. And yet, Holmes had the final word. He stood from his chair that evening, reached for the small box on the mantel, and placed it gently into a larger case, marked "Resolved." Then he turned to me and said with a faint smile, "Time to write it down, Watson. And time to end it." Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. It was nearly spring when the final chapter of the case passed into memory, the streets of London shedding their winter mist for a lighter, gentler air. Life resumed its steady rhythm. The newspapers had moved on. The public's brief fascination with whispers of ritual deaths and deathless artifacts faded beneath the weight of more tangible newsbank failures. Foreign dignitaries, a new bridge somewhere north of the city. No one spoke of the mask now. No one spoke of the cough. I had finished writing my account, of course, not for the public, but for Holmes himself. It was a habit we had developed after particularly difficult cases, those in which the villain was not just a person, but a concept. This story had demanded more than clarity. It had demanded restraint. Holmes read it slowly over the course of a few days, not offering his usual flurry of marginal notes or muttered edits. When he reached the final page, he closed the leather-bound draft and sat silently by the window for a long time. "I left something out," I admitted. Holmes glanced at me. "What was that?" "The moment you decided to walk into the museum alone," I said. "The moment you let him believe you'd come without protection, without any trick or plan. That wasn't deduction. That was faith." Holmes's smile was slight. "Not faith, Watson. It was calculation. I knew what he expected of me and I gave it to him. But I also knew he believed too much in his own design. That was his flaw. He mistook belief for control." He stood and paced toward the fireplace, his fingers resting briefly on the box that still held the cloth-wrapped thread. "He did not open it." "You were right," I said. "This was never a case about murder. It was about story. But I still don't know why it affected you more than others we've seen." Holmes turned to face me fully then. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than usual. "Because, Watson, this case revealed something I often try to ignore, that logic alone does not protect people. That fear, when given a shape and passed from one mind to the next, becomes more contagious than any disease. You saw it in Ransom, in Morrigan, in the way even you hesitated to enter certain rooms." He looked down briefly. It reminded me that the world does not require truth to suffer. It only needs plausibility. We stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling behind us. Outside, the first signs of spring touched the trees beyond the fogged glass. Holmes stepped forward and opened the drawer where the thread had been kept. It was empty now. "I burned it," he said simply. I looked up, startled. "When?" "Last night," Holmes replied, not as part of his ritual. Not for fear, but because the story must end. As long as it existed, Evans, it remained open, a lingering shadow. "And do you believe it's truly over?" I asked. Holmes considered this, then nodded. "Yes, because stories require listeners, and I am no longer listening." He returned to his chair, and with an ease I had not seen in weeks, picked up his violin. A gentle note floated through the room, soft, reflective, untouched by darkness. As he played, I sat at the desk and added a single line to the final page of my manuscript. Sherlock Holmes did not destroy the mask to silence fear. He destroyed it to remind the world that reason, once spoken clearly, echoes louder than any whisper in the dark. The music continued long into the evening, and when at last the day faded entirely, there were no coughs in the night, only quiet, and in that quiet, peace. I closed the curtain slowly, listening to the faint rasp of the fabric as it slid across the brass rod. The street beyond was still. A light mist had crept back over the rooftops, curling around the chimneys like smoke rising from old thoughts. As I stepped back into the warm glow of the sitting room, I saw Holmes seated once again in his chair, this time without a book, without a pipe. He was simply resting, his fingers lightly folded, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance beyond the fireplace. I sat opposite him, letting the quiet settle between us. It was not the silence of fear that had haunted our early nights in this case, nor the dreadful stillness of suppressed breath. It was peaceful, but also reflective, as though the room itself was trying to understand what it had just witnessed. Holmes spoke at last, his voice low and steady. "You know, Watson, there are moments even for me when I wonder if the mind is ever entirely our own, or if, like a mirror, it simply reflects what others place in front of it." He turned his gaze to me. Finch knew that he saw how easily fear could be suggested, how subtly it could become belief. But what he didn't understand, what he refused to understand, is that clarity cannot be destroyed once it is known. We saw through it, and now others will too. I nodded. He wanted the world to doubt itself. "Yes," Holmes said, "but doubt, when examined closely, becomes its own kind of certainty. A man who questions his fear may still feel it, but he will not obey it." We both looked toward the desk where the closed manuscript sat, the cover leather-worn and ink-smudged. That volume now held the full story of the mask, the myth, the man who tried to outlive his name. And as Holmes had requested, I had written it, not as a tale of supernatural dread, but as a testament to the human mind's remarkable capacity for both vulnerability and reason. Later, Holmes rose and walked to the bookshelf. He slid the manuscript between two older volumes, one of philosophy, the other of criminal psychology. It fit there perfectly, as though it belonged to both worlds. And then he turned to me, his eyes sharp once more. "Come, Watson, let us get some air. London has returned to itself." We stepped outside into the early hours, the street lamp flickering gently above us. The fog no longer pressed in close. It merely lingered, soft and harmless, like breath on glass. There was no cough in the air, only the sound of Holmes lighting a match to his cigarette, and the distant footfalls of a milk cart beginning its morning route. The world had moved on, and so, with quiet satisfaction, did we.